What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to build my biggest piece to date, this kind of Credenza bookcase combo. So this is two separate pieces, just in case you're wondering right off the bat. Obviously, this is way too big to move if it was one single piece. So kind of a cool modular system. It's all built out of pure bond walnut veneer plywood. Love the way it came out. I did some hardwood edge banding to cover up the edges of the plywood, and I really like the way that looks, and just overall super happy with the way this project came together. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the build.
To break down the plywood sheets, I used a combination of tools, first starting at the table saw to break down the larger pieces. After ripping the pieces to length, I crosscut them to width using my rockler crosscut sled. For some of the longer pieces that were just too long to manage with the crosscut sled, I used my track saw and cut the matching pieces at the same time to make sure they were the exact same size. The side panels of the bookcase section have a decorative curved section cut out, so next I worked on getting those cut to shape. I traced the curve using a compass and then ripped a straight line at the table saw to the point where the curve started. Next I used my jigsaw to cut the curve, but I was left with kind of an uneven curve and just couldn't get it dialed in by hand to where I was happy with it. The human eye is really good at seeing when circular objects aren't perfectly round, so I was having a tough time with this. Then I remembered I have an X-carve, so I used that to knock out a quick curve template. I trimmed off the excess from the side panel and then attached the template with double stick tape, and then used a flush trim bit in my router to route the side panel flush with the template, and this left me with an absolutely perfect curve. With the curve cut, I ripped the straight section flush with the curve at the table saw off camera, and then could create the matching panel using the completed panel as the template. I cut away the excess using a jigsaw and then clamped the two panels together and used the router to flush cut the edges. Once the edges were cut, I came back with a sanding block just to remove any tool marks and get the edges perfectly even. With all the pieces cut out, next I needed to start getting the plywood edges covered up with edge banding. And in the past, I've always used peel and stick edge banding, but it can be really fragile and kind of has a tendency to crack and can just kind of be a pain to work with. So on this build, I decided to cut my own hardwood edge banding, which I did with the bandsaw. And each strip was roughly 3/16 of an inch thick, which gave me plenty of material to work with. After ripping the strips at the bandsaw, I smoothed them all out at the drum sander and brought them all down to a consistent thickness. If you don't have a drum sander, you could rip these strips at the table saw and they would be plenty smooth enough for this type of application. To attach the edge banding to the panels, I used glue and clamped the banding in place using Rockler's bandy clamps. And I thought I had way too many of these things, but ended up using every single one of them multiple times on this build. There was just a ton of edge banding to glue on. And as you can see, the edge banding was left about 1/4 of an inch wider than the plywood, just to leave plenty of overhang on each side. So after the glue dried, I needed to flush up the edge banding. I used a trim router and a spiral flush trim bit to do this, and I found this awesome little lipper attachment from FastCap for my trim router, and that allowed me to run my trim router on edge. This was the perfect tool for the job, and I was able to perfectly trim all of the edge banding super quick. The only tricky part of the edge banding process was the curved edges on the panels. The 3/16 inch thick edge banding was just a little too thick for this, so I brought it down to about 1/8 of an inch thick, but it was still just a little bit too brittle. I used some hot water to soften up the wood, and then clamped it to the template I had cut earlier and let it dry, which helped it keep that shape. After it dried, I glued it onto the side panels just like the rest of the edge banding, and it worked perfect. With all the edge banding applied, I could move on to the joinery for the Credenza cabinet. I used my domino for this process, but you could definitely use dados, dowel joinery, pocket holes. There are tons of other options for cabinet construction out there. I used the wing attachments on the domino to get even spacing from the edges of the cabinet, so I didn't need to mark out all of the domino locations, and this really sped things up, and I was able to cut all the joinery for the cabinet super quickly. To cut the mortises for the center dividers, I clamped one of the dividers to the top or bottom panels, made sure it was nice and square, and used that as the reference surface for the domino, and that worked out really nicely. Once all the mortises were cut for the Credenza, I went ahead and glued it up, which went pretty smoothly, although I used way too much glue and had a ton of squeeze out to contend with. While I'm working, let's talk about one of the sponsors of this week's video, Pure Bond Plywood. I really love using Pure Bond. It's a formaldehyde-free hardwood plywood that's made in the USA, actually right down the road from me here in North Carolina, and it's super high quality. Basically, anytime I'm using plywood on a project, especially for furniture, I'm using Pure Bond. Pure Bond is formaldehyde-free, uses soy-based glues, and is available exclusively at Home Depot. I'll have a link in the video description if you'd like to learn more. With the Credenza carcass drying, I moved on to the bookcase, which was basically the same as the Credenza. Once again, I used the domino for the joinery and it went really quickly. Also, I am just loving the assembly table I built a few months ago. The T-track clamps are super handy, and I've got plans available in case you're interested in building one of these tables for yourself. I use it on every build, and it's really become one of the most essential pieces in my shop. Once all the joinery was cut, I moved on to gluing up the bookcase, which was a real challenge due to just the sheer size of the piece. I didn't have any clamps long enough to reach across the 64-inch wide bookcase, so I used some strap clamps, which actually worked out really well. This was definitely a stressful glue up though, and having an extra set of hands would have been really helpful here for sure. Since the bookcase and Credenza cabinets are two separate units, I had to kind of think through how the two would attach later on, and I decided to add a strip to the bottom back edge of the bookcase to allow a mending plate to be attached and a few screws to be added from behind later on. I attached this strip using pocket screws since these screws will be covered up by the back panel anyway. Next, I needed to notch out the bottom dividers on the bookcase so that they could be attached around this strip, and I marked out the notch using the strip as reference and then cut the notch using my bandsaw. With the strip in place and the dividers notched, I could glue the dividers in place using the domino mortises I cut earlier, and I used these rockler corner clamps to make sure the dividers were nice and square to the shelves while the glue dried. Once the glue dried, I came back and attached the strip to the dividers using a couple of screws from the backside of the strip just to give the dividers a little more stability. With all the pieces in place, I could attach the back panel to the bookcase and Credenza. I used 1/4-inch Pure Bond walnut veneer plywood for the back panel just to match the rest of the cabinet, and I cut the sections to rough size at the table saw. Before gluing on the back panel, I marked out all the locations of the shelves and dividers so I knew exactly where I could add brad nails to hold the panel in place while the glue dried. I also added a few spacers to the topmost shelf just to make sure it didn't sag or bow at all during the glue up. Next, I added glue to the back edges of all the pieces, dropped the back panel into place, and added 1-inch brad nails every foot or so. After the glue dried, I came back with a flush trim bit on my router and flushed the back panel up with the sides of the bookcase and Credenza. And with the back panel flushed up, I swapped to a chamfer bit and chamfered the edges of the back panel so that the chamfered edge was flush with the sides of the cabinets. And this little trick really helps to hide the back panel and gives it a super clean look. Now that the Credenza carcass was finished, I could cut the doors and shelves to size based on the actual final size of the Credenza. And this was more the same process, cutting the pieces to size from plywood and then adding a bunch of hardwood edge banding. And I did accidentally cut some of the shelves a little too narrow, so I made up for that extra length by adding a little bit thicker edge banding, which actually worked out perfectly. I didn't show most of the sanding on this build, as you might have noticed, just because it's kind of boring, but there was definitely plenty of it, and I got through a lot of audiobooks on this project. While I'm sanding, let's talk about one of the sponsors of this week's video, Rockler Woodworking and Hardware. I used a ton of Rockler projects during this build, including their bandy clamps, T-track clamps, crosscut sled, tapering jig, bench cookies, and lots more. I'll have links to all the items I used in the video description below. Rockler's got tons of great tools and accessories for your next build, and they're always coming up with new and innovative ideas to help make your woodworking more efficient and more enjoyable. Thanks again to the folks at Rockler for sponsoring this build. Next, I could start getting the hardware added to the Credenza. First, I drilled the shelf pin holes using a homemade jig, and I used these 1/4-inch brass shelf pins, which I think look super nice with the walnut. Next, I drilled the holes for the inside hinges I used on this project. I used this little Kreg hinge jig, which allowed me to drill perfectly square holes without using my drill press, and it also has guides for pilot holes for the screws that actually hold the hinge in place. It was really useful, and I'll have a link to it in the video description below in case you're interested. For the door pull, I decided to keep it nice and simple and just drill a hole right through the door. I used an 1.5 inch Forstner bit for this and drilled the hole over the drill press. After I drilled the hole in the door, I chamfered both sides to give it a nice clean look and a better feel. And I really like the way these pulls look on the final piece. They're super clean, minimal, and obviously really easy. Next, I hung the doors on the cabinet, first marking out the screw locations and pre-drilling before adding the doors. These Bloom soft close hinges are nice and adjustable, and it was really easy to get an even reveal all the way around the door. Also, I just love how smoothly they close. It's so satisfying. The last part of this build was the base, which you might have seen in previous shots. I actually built the base along the way, but figured I'd keep it all together to make it a little easier to follow in the video. So I only had 5/4 walnut on hand, so I first needed to mill that wood square and then glue up some of the pieces to get the 8/4 final thickness I was looking for on this base. This base will be supporting a ton of weight between the bookcase, the credenza, and all the contents of the two pieces once they're loaded up, so I wanted something really beefy. After the glue up, I milled all the parts square, cut them to length over the miter saw, and then cut a taper on the legs using the rockler tapering jig. I ideally wanted splayed legs on this piece, but I was worried that there would just be too much weight on the legs and the splay would cause the legs to fail. For the joinery on the base, I used, you guessed it, dominoes, and the process went super quick. I used 2 dominoes per corner, and this made for a super strong base. Once all the mortises were cut, I glued the base together, and also you can tell how long I've been working on this piece since I still had the pegboard up in the background of this shot. This project's been lurking in the background for a few months, and I'm really happy to have it finally finished up. To attach the base to the underside of the credenza, I used 1.25" pocket screws, so I needed to drill some recessed holes for those screws. I used a Forstner bit to drill the recess, and then drilled the through hole using a twist bit. Before attaching the base to the credenza, I gave it a good sanding, and then used the aforementioned pocket screws to permanently attach the base to the underside of the credenza. After sanding all the parts up to 180 grit off camera, it was finally time to apply a finish. I went with General Finishes Endurovar, which is a waterborne polyurethane, and sprayed it on with my Fuji Q3 HVLP system. And you could certainly wipe on or brush on a finish on a piece like this, but it would have taken forever. These huge pieces are really where spraying finish excels, and I was able to finish this whole piece in an afternoon, spraying 3 coats in total and scuff sanding before the last coat. The last step on this build was to attach the credenza to the bookcase, and this is really just a safety mechanism. It just keeps the bookcase from sliding off the credenza when it's in use. And I needed to make sure the screws went into the dividers in the credenza, so I measured and marked out exactly where to add the plate. And then on the bookcase, it didn't really matter where the screws landed, since I added that strip during the build process. And with that, this massive build was finally finished, and man, that was a lot of work.
All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. This was a pretty massive undertaking for me, definitely my biggest project to date, but I'm super happy with the way it came out. There were a lot of really time-consuming steps. For example, putting on the hardwood edge banding on all of these edges took a really long time, but I just love the way it came together. So if you guys want more info on how to build this project, I will have plans available. You can check out my website for that. I'll have a link in the video description below. Also in the video description below, I'll have links to all the tools and materials I used on this build, which there were a lot of them. And last, I want to say a big thanks to the sponsors of this week's video. Without my sponsors, I could not do this for a living. So if you guys want to support me, support my sponsors. All right, thanks again for watching, everybody. And until next time, happy building. And last, I want to say, God dang it, bird, quiet.